So a young lady came up to me before services and asked if I would cut my sermon in half because she didn't really want to sit through the whole thing. So no promises, no promises. I didn't get to preach last week, and her and her family will have a good laugh afterwards after the services, but I'm not going to mention any names. But I didn't get to preach last week, so I can't make any promises about how long this is going to be. But I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate the encouragement that comes from getting to see you all and spend some time with you. And I was thinking about this psalm. We've been working through the Psalms and learning these lessons from the Psalms and breaking them up. And the next section or large block of Psalms consists of several chapters, which are relatively short, but it addresses the idea of confidence and trust, things that we can be assured of, things that we can be confident of. So I was thinking about some things that we talk about, especially in America, about what we're confident of. And there's a phrase that we've used for I don't know how long, but there's only one thing that is certain, and that is what? Death and taxes, right? I mean, we say that a lot, but we try to cheat both of those. A lot of people do. I don't cheat taxes. I don't do that. But people try to, but we try to cheat both of those. But ultimately, that's inevitable. We find ourselves in that situation. But there are some things that are just not certain, and we struggle with those things. We don't know what to do with those things. We find them some uncertainty with life, and it can be very disheartening, discouraging. We have the idea of trust. Trusting people is really difficult, and even those within our closest circle, we struggle to put confidence in people and things. And so this psalm is so important. Psalm 3 is so incredibly important for us as followers of Jesus to embrace and to put our confidence in God and rely on Him and His grace and His mercy. And so the psalm itself really is wrapped around, or at least a lot of Bible scholars believe it's wrapped around David's experience with his third son, Absalom. And if you kind of remember the story, one of David's sons is murdered by Absalom, and there's this big ordeal, and he is ran out of the city, and he is then invited back into the city over a period of time. And so that's basically the idea. But what we know about David is that although he was, as the scriptures tell us, a man after God's own heart, he had issues in his life, he had struggles, and his family often was in turmoil. And his family, we find, was rebellious and in some cases murderous. And it's really a story that we hear a lot about with God's people and the families that God worked with, that they were not perfect. And there were issues even within the family that needed to be dealt with. But one of the things I want us to think about this morning is whether your behavior, and kind of thinking about David and the things he's done, and whether your behavior is good or bad, whether it's good or bad, your behavior, what you do, is ultimately going to affect not just you, but the people around you. Have you experienced that in your life? That whether good or bad, the things that you do don't always just affect you, but they also affect the people around you. The choices that you make, will affect you, and it will affect the people around you. And there's no doubt that David sinned. We know David's sin. We know the situation with Bathsheba. We know that there were these times of weakness in David's life, but regardless of how broken he was during those times and the despair that he experienced, he never stopped calling upon the mercies of God. He never stopped trusting in God. He would return to God in sorrow, and God was faithful to forgive him. We know that. We know from the Psalms, we know from the scriptures that God forgave David for the sins that he committed. But we also know that David was not free. Just because he had freedom from sin in regards to God, he was not free from the consequences of his sin. That freedom from sin restored the relationship he had with his God. But his sin had consequences. Ultimately, his sin has consequences. And that story is the same with us as well. I was thinking of different analogies, but this one kind of came to mind right away. So I thought, if a thief breaks into a house, right, and they go in and they steal something, and they may break in, they may steal, and they may be forgiven of that sin. I mean, ultimately, a person can be in desperate and dire straits and commit a sin like theft and be forgiven of that sin. But that doesn't mean that that individual is going to be free from any of the consequences of their actions. That person who stole might be forgiven, but ultimately they have to face the court. They have to face the consequences, whether it's jail time, whether it's fine, the criminal record that goes along with it. All of that goes with the action itself. And so the whole idea, not being free from the consequences, even though we can be free from sin. But we have a tendency to make our lives a lot harder. Okay, I have a tendency to make my life a lot harder than it needs to be because of choices that I make each and every day. Right? I mean, I do that. I know I do that. I'm sure that everybody has done that at some point in their life, but we have a tendency to make our life more difficult than it needs to be. So as we're reading through this story, I want us to spend some time in 2 Samuel chapter 15. So if you have your Bibles out, go ahead and open there, 2 Samuel chapter 15. And we're going to kind of pick up on the backstory of the psalm and then move into the psalm really quickly. And so verses 1 through 5, then again, this is the story that I've already presented to you. Absalom had to flee for murdering his brother. He's been brought back. And David is currently king. But his kingship is being threatened. And it says in verse 1 of 2 Samuel 15, he says, "Now it came about after this that Absalom provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him." So you can kind of imagine what that must have looked like in this place, that something's going on. This person is somebody. And then it says Absalom used to rise early in the morning and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a suit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" So you can imagine him being at the gate and people are coming in to bring their grievance to the king. And he says, "Come on over here. I'm the king's son. Come see me." And he says, "What city are you from?" And he would say, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel," and so on. And so there's a plot that's already hatched in the mind of this son that he's going to systematically, little by little, win the hearts of the people, draw people to him, and turn people away from his father. If he can draw attention to himself and bring people into himself, make himself somebody, raise his status, elevate himself amongst the people, then that would be used as leverage. So look at verse 3. And it says, "Then Absalom would say to him, 'See, your claims are good and they're right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king.'" And so just really an accusation to say, you have no representation here. The king doesn't seem to really be concerned because he hasn't provided someone to stand between you and he and speak your grievance. And making the people feel like they don't have a say. And you can just imagine how people would think, well, yeah, you're kind of right. I mean, I've been here before maybe, and I've tried to have I asked to see the king, and I wasn't able to, and I talked to somebody, but it didn't seem to be dealt with. And so now we're in this situation where this son of the king is saying, well, I'll take care of it. I'll deal with it. I'll make it right. I'll be the one that comes between you and the king. Now look at verse 4. He says, moreover, Absalom would say, oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land. And then every man who has any suit or cause could come to me, and I would give him justice. You know, this is a man who seemingly has some authority, who seems to have access to the king. He's making himself available to the people so that they have no problems finding him. In fact, he finds them. And you can just imagine how people would feel when they had an issue, they wanted it dealt with. They didn't have to go track somebody down to share their grievance. They can just go to the city. Absalom would find them and offer to deal with the situation. I mean, he's really just playing politics, right? He's shaking hands and kissing babies and making promises and all the things that we see out of people who desire to be great. And then it says, and when a man came near to prostrate himself before him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. And in this manner, Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. So then Absalom goes to his father after this, and he requests to go to Hebron, and he claims that it was because of a vow that he made, and his father says, yeah, go ahead. You know, he's none the while. He doesn't know what's going on, or seemingly doesn't know what's going on in the background. And as a strategic move, he makes it look as if with others and people around him, and he even calls one of David's counselors to come, and all of this takes place, and it just looks like that Absalom is becoming greater and greater every day. And strategically, he steals the heart of that community, and it becomes a major stepping stone for him to overthrow his father and to take over the kingdom. It's all part of this scheme he has. Now look at verse 10. He says, but Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom is king of Hebron. Right? I mean, if you could just hear everybody saying this, you know, you've got people going around and whispering into people's ears and encouraging that. And suddenly you hear the trumpet, and everybody, all these people are starting to say that Absalom is king of Hebron. And then 200 men went with Absalom from Jerusalem who were invited and went innocently, and they did not know anything. And so he's really just being extremely deceptive with his actions and making the appearance that something is happening when in reality it really isn't. In verse 12, he says, and Absalom sent Ahithophel, that's a hard word to say, the Gileadite and David's counselor from the city of Gilead, while he was offering the sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. I mean, could you imagine? Could you imagine this? Could you imagine your own son turning against you? Could you imagine the people listening to the deceiver and listening to the lies and hearing the deception and the conspiracy? And little by little, the hearts of the people are being won over. And here he is slowly but surely moving up in the ranks as the people begin to favor him over the king. But the whole time, we know that his goal is to completely overthrow his father. And David finds out about this, but by the time David finds out, it is way too late. He realizes that, you know what, there's nothing I can do. The people are against me. They're all for my son, Absalom. I just need to get out of here. So he takes his few and he flees and he runs away from his own son. And he remains in flight for some time as his son and really all of Israel goes and tries to find him and kill him. And he takes the throne. David's son takes the throne by force, right? And overthrows his father. But we have to also remember, and this is where it comes down to actions. This wasn't something that David just stumbled across. This wasn't something that just happened out of the blue. But what the scriptures teach us is that this turmoil within David's family was going to happen because it was a result of something David has already done. He created turmoil in somebody else's family. He created distress in somebody else's family. If you remember the story, it wasn't very long back in 2 Samuel where David had seen Uriah's wife, and he decided, I want that woman for myself, and he took her. And to cover it all up, he kills Uriah, or has him killed, and then he destroys this one family so that he can have what he wants and take advantage of his kingship. And remember, Nathan comes to him and tells him about this, and it explains to him that, this was wrong. And David does ultimately come to repentance, but towards the end of 2 Samuel chapter 12, look what he says. He says, thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you from your own household. I will even take your wives before your eyes and give them to your companions, and he will lie with them, your wives in broad daylight. Indeed, you did secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and under the sun. And we know that David was forgiven. We know that David was he remorsed, he was broken, he repented, and we know that God is willing to forgive even such a grievous sin as that, because David's heart turned to God. David's heart was with God. But we also know from this that David is not going to be free from the consequences of his actions, that even his closest people will ultimately turn against him. Where is David going to turn? Where is his confidence going to be? Where is his trust? Who can he trust in such a time like this when even his closest people are going to turn against him? But could you imagine how this must have felt? I mean, could you imagine what it must have felt like for his friends to betray him, for his people to betray him, for his son to conspire against him? Because he loved his son. That's why Absalom came back, because David longed for his presence. He longed for his son. He couldn't stand his son to have been away from him. But then once he finally comes back, this is what happens. This is the other side of that. This is how his son treats him. And could you imagine what that must have felt like? And now he's forced to abandon his throne, to flee for his life, right? And we may face some difficulties, right? I mean, but have we ever faced anything quite this extreme? I mean, this is kind of the pinnacle of extremeness as we think about circumstances and conspiracies against us and the overthrowing of a kingdom. This is incredible. It's an extreme circumstance. But there's no doubt that we can face adversity, right? We can face adversity, especially adversity that we had no dealings with, that just kind of came upon us because we may have trusted in somebody, or we may have put our faith in somebody, or whatever the case may be, and they conspired against us. And we think, well, I've been there. We've all been there. We've had family. I mean, if you've ever had to deal with an inheritance or a will, it's even the best of people suddenly turn into horrible people because things just get really messy. And so we see that even those who we think I can put my trust in them, they would never do that. They would never say that. They would never turn against me. That in our life we find people turning against us. Even those we feel close to, people turn against us. People conspire against us, and we find that in our own life. Sometimes we see it in just health problems, and we don't really have anything that we have done to bring it about, right? It just happened, and we think, well, why is it happening to me? Why am I dealing with this? I can't even trust the world in which I live in. I can't even trust my own body. I haven't done anything to cause this problem, but suddenly here I am with all of these issues, and I don't know what to do. Who do we turn to for confidence? Who do we put our trust in? And during tragedy, where do we put our trust? I would like to think that nobody is going to turn against me. That's kind of what I would like to think. I'd like to be, blissfully ignorant. I would like to think that I can trust anyone and believe anything. And I think that a lot of us, unfortunately, become very cynical. And that's a dangerous place to be. It's dangerous to become cynical. It's dangerous to not put ourselves out there, right? Especially in the church, especially as people of God. Yes, people in the church could turn against you. I mean, that happens. And we may say things that hurt other people, but we cannot become calloused. We cannot become cynical. We cannot fall into the trap and lose our faith in each other. Because during times of tragedy and times of adversity, this is where we need to be able to turn for help in times of difficulties. But we become cynical more often than not. But as God's covenant people, the question would be, would we continue to trust? Would we continue to put our confidence in our relationship to God in the midst of tragedy? And I think that's where David is. He is willing to put his faith and trust in God. He's willing to rely on God in spite of what's going on. So if we turn to Psalm 3, this psalm is believed to be written by David about this very circumstance. He's fleeing from his son. We have to remember this was not just for David. Sometimes we write things or we think about reading things and we think, well, that was just David and his experience. But there's a reason that we have these things. There's a reason we have these in our Bibles. There's a reason that it's written so that Israel can go and read these things, so that Israel can go and study these things, so that we can turn and look at what David was experiencing and how he felt and where he put his trust, and we can find the strength to do the same. So think about this as we read through Psalm 3. It's relatively short. He says in verse 1, he says, "O Lord, how my adversaries have increased. Many are rising up against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no deliverance for him in God." Right? The reality is it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good. That's the reality. And you can almost imagine these people who are still there and they see Absalom going up to the throne and they think, well, that must be a work of God because there's David and he's fleeing with a few of the faithful and God must be at work here. And they might think, well, what did David do? Or they may know about what David did. And they may be looking at him and finding that God is not with him anymore. That God is against David. That's not the truth. But I'm sure that's what it looked like. That's how it appears to the outside world. That's how it appears to the people. And they see no hope. In their perspective, God has indeed forsaken him. But look at the rest of the psalm. He says in verse 3, "But you, Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the one who lifts my head. I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain." Right? They say that God has forsaken him. They seem to believe that David is a cursed man and he's getting what he deserves. But David knows better. David knows better. He knows and he looks to God and he remembers that it is God who is his shield, that it is his glory to be in a covenant relationship with God, that God is the one who lifts up his head, the one who hears him cry. And could you imagine being in a circumstance where you're trying to say what's right and you're sitting there and you're in the kingdom and you're saying, no, I'm still king, follow me. But all the people have already turned their hearts against him. And there's nothing he can say. The only choice he has is just to run because he knows that if he doesn't, he's not going to live, right? And so he's thinking, who's going to listen to my cry? Who's going to listen to me plea? Who is going to listen to my side of the story? And David says, God will. God will. He will always hear the truth of the matter. He knows the truth of the matter. David can trust God. Look at verse 5. He says, I laid down to sleep and I awoke, for the Lord sustains me. Right? I will not be afraid of 10,000 people who have set themselves against me around about. So this kind of reminds me of Jesus. Remember Jesus in Matthew chapter 8 when he was in the boat with his disciples and the storm is raging all over and Jesus is sleeping and his disciples are like, we're about to die and you're not taking care of us. What are you going to do? How can you sleep at a time like this? And they wake him up and then Jesus says this in verse 26. He says, why are you afraid? Why are you afraid, you men of little faith? And then he got up and he rebuked the wind and the sea and it became perfectly calm. Right? The psalmist is saying, your numbers may be great, and you may be against me, and you may be after me, and you may be trying to take my life, and you may see me as the enemy and not a friend, and things may seem bad. But he says, as for me, I sleep in peace. In spite of the turmoil, in spite of the difficulty, in spite of everything that seems bad in my life, I sleep in peace because of who is with me. And who I am with, and who I have the ability to call upon, the God of creation, the God of the covenant, my God. I sleep well because I know who I belong to. Look at verse 7. He says, arise, O Lord, save me, O God. For you have smitten all of my enemies on the cheek. You have shattered the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be upon your people. Right? Could you imagine, just imagine for just a minute, Israel having been taken because of their idolatry from their land and taken into Babylonian captivity and how awful that may have looked. And even the Babylonians are looking at them and thinking, your God's forsaken you. He doesn't care about you. If he cared about you, we never would have been able to take you because we know your God and we know that people in the past have tried and failed and we've tried and failed, but now he's allowed us to take you. Your God has forsaken you. But even in Babylonian captivity, they were still God's covenant people. And they had to read Psalms like this. They would read Psalm 3 and they would remember and think about David and think about their circumstances and be comforted, knowing that salvation belongs to the Lord. Or could you imagine being a Christian in the first century at a time where Christianity was not the right religion to be. And the Romans had their way, and the Jews had their way, and then Christians were in the middle, and they suffered greatly. And could you imagine being a Christian and being thrown into the lion's den, and other Christians are singing the Psalm 3 about David and his difficulties? Or could you imagine being burned at the stake and having people sing that song and remembering that God is my salvation? That the enemies may be great, that there may be strong. I mean, things don't look good, but ultimately God will rescue his covenant people. And could you imagine what Jesus must have thought and what the people must have thought about Jesus as he is taken and he's hung on a cross? And then in chapter 27 of Matthew in verse 42, it says, he saved others. This is what people are seeing of Jesus. They're looking at him and they're thinking, he's made all these claims. He says that he's in a relationship with God. He says that he's the Messiah. He says he's the king. He says he's God, but look at him, bleeding on a cross. And it says, they said, he saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him now come down from the cross, and then we'll believe him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now. If he delights in him, for he said, I am the Son of God. Could you imagine being in that kind of circumstance? Because the reality is, Christians find themselves in that circumstance sometimes. Christians in the past have found themselves in that circumstance. They have found themselves at the hands of the enemy. They have found themselves near death. And people have mocked them. People have scoffed at him. People have done to Christians what they did to Jesus, but ultimately Jesus is going to be like David in Psalm 3, and he's going to recognize that it is his Father who he has to appeal to, not these people who scoff, not the people who say whatever they want to say. It's not about them. It's about the fact that he knows who he can call out to, and so do we. We understand that as well. And despite the fact that Jesus was obviously free from sin, he's dying for the consequences of the sins of the people around him, of the people of Israel. We, however, when we read Psalms and we read Psalm 3, we have to recognize that sometimes the troubles we face are of our own making. They're because we have failed to be faithful to the covenant. And we have to be extremely sensitive to that. But we also have to realize that God is a forgiving and merciful God. So here's our thought for this morning. Living the Psalms is living with confidence, knowing that salvation belongs to the Lord. And oh, how grateful we are for that. So if there's anybody here this morning, maybe you have fallen short of your covenant relationship and you need reconciliation, and that coming home is available to you to be brought back into fellowship with God and be forgiven of your sins. Maybe you're going through some difficult times and you need some prayers. Maybe you have never entered into a covenant relationship with God. The opportunity to be baptized into Jesus and receive the gift of the Holy Spirit is available for you this morning. If any need you may have, you would come forward as we stand and as we sing.